Eleanor rose before the first light of dawn, her slumbering bones protesting the betrayal of another sleepless night, and moved to her small cottage with the deliberate economy of one whose routines had long since become vessels to contain a grief too vast for words. The hearth, once a place of warmth and gathering, lay cold and unlit, its ash-strewn stones bearing silent witness to the slow unraveling of hope. She carried water from the well at the back of the yard. The metal pails weighed in her hands, a faint reminder of the simpler chores that once accompanied her son's laughter, his running feet trampling the dewy grass, his bright voice calling out to birds in the orchard. Now, each creak of the floorboard beneath her foot reminded her that the world continued its indifferent turning, even as her heart remained tethered to the memory of his last farewell. The morning air, crisp and laced with the scent of pine and damp earth, pressed against her skin in gentle reproach for the candle she dared not light, its single wick curled like a shameful secret in the cold darkness of the mantel's corner. Across the humble room, a single object lay undisturbed upon a shelf, its very presence resonating with the weight of destiny. A letter sealed in black wax, its envelope thick and cream-colored, waited patiently for her touch, promising both closure and agonizing remembrance. Eleanor's fingers hovered above it for a long moment. Her breath caught in her throat as she remembered her son's trembling hand as he pressed a missive into her grasp 7 years ago, urging her to open it only if she found herself lost or alone. She recalled how, at the time, she had laughed, her tears falling freely as she trusted that the day of opening would remain a distant other in a future she could scarcely imagine. But time's merciless march had delivered her to this morning, when the promise of reunion was extinguished by the tale of his death on a distant battlefield. She closed her eyes and felt the letter's weight like a stone in her palm, its significance more profound than the heaviest iron that had bound him in captivity or the sharpest shard that had claimed him in combat. The memory of his last look, calm, resolute, and tinged with unspoken love, ignited a fierce ache within her, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine him alive once more, standing in the doorway with dust upon his boots and wonder in his eyes. The village beyond her window stirred into life in muted increments, roosters crowing with practiced insistence, tendrils of smoke spiraling from chimneys, and the faint whistles of women calling their children to breakfast. Yet the morning felt suspended in a hush that belonged solely to Eleanor, as though the world around her recognized the threshold she had crossed and waited with bated breath. She set down the water and approached the hearth, where the blackened stone seemed to press inward, eager to reclaim the warmth that had long since departed from her home. Kneeling before it, she reached out and brushed her fingertips across the cold surface, recalling the nights when the flames had danced like living creatures, casting golden light upon the walls and illuminating the smiles of family gathered in spirited conversation. Those evenings had been a tapestry of sound and color, pots clanking, embers popping, the low hum of her son's voice as he recounted the day's adventures. Now the silence that surrounded her felt more absolute than any void she had known before, a cavernous emptiness that echoed with the absence of his presence. In that stillness, grief seeped into her chest like an extra lung she had not known she possessed, expanding until it pressed against her ribs and made each breath both painful and precious. When she finally touched the letter, her fingers trembled so violently that she feared she might tear the fragile paper. She brought it to her face and inhaled the faintly sweet scent of aged parchment, as if the letter itself carried a remnant of her son's warmth. Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears as she released the wax seal and unfolded the pages, the slow crackle of paper filling the quiet room with its fragile lament. Her eyes traced each line of her son's handwriting, precise yet infused with a slight slant that spoke of his hurry to write between drills and marches, of his longing to reach home despite the distance that separated them. The letter began with reassurances of his safety and account of the camaraderie he shared with fellow soldiers, but as the prose deepened it spoke of battles fought under a blood-red sky, of victories etched in sorrow, of the cold dread that accompanied each dawn. The final paragraph was an apology for the pain his absence would bring, for the tears she would shed, for the broken dreams that would gather like storm clouds above her heart. Eleanor read the closing words with her eyes blurred by tears, her mind stumbling over the final sentence. If you open this letter, know that I carried your love into every trial, and that I long for the day I return to you. The enormity of those words shattered her, and she pressed her cheek against the parchment, her tears soaking the ink as she surrendered to the tidal wave of loss. She sat there for hours, the dawn ripening into full morning light, until the sun's rays climbed high enough to invade the room and chase away the shadows. The stillness gave way to the sounds of life. The creaking of the back door as the orphan boy she had taken and emerged to tend the chickens, the distant laughter of neighbors sharing gossip in the lane, the soft rustle of wind through the orchard beyond her window. Yet Eleanor remained rooted to the hearth, the letter crumpled in her palm like the fragile skeleton of her hopes. It was only when the child's tentative footsteps reached the threshold of her cottage that she became aware of the world beyond her grief. He stood there with his small face streaked with sleep and curiosity, clutching a basket of eggs as though afraid to disturb the hush that enveloped her. For a moment their eyes met, and in that silent exchange Eleanor felt the tug of life's unyielding march forward. The boy's presence, once a source of comfort and gentle distraction, now emerged as a reminder of the fragile promise that love could be given again, that new bonds had formed even as old ones lay buried beneath layers of sorrow. With an effort that felt like swimming against the current, Eleanor folded the letter and tucked it into the bosom of her worn dress, its contents now sealed within her heart. She rose unsteadily and motioned for the boy to join her at the hearth, where she would prepare porridge and offer him the warmth she could no longer find in the flames. As she stirred the oats, the earthy aroma filling the room, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth that grief was not a solitary confinement, but a companion she could neither banish nor embrace fully. It existed alongside her capacity to care for this fragile child, to cultivate her small garden, to weave linens for the widows of the village. Somewhere within the hollows carved by her son's absence lay a seed of resilience, a quiet conviction that though her world had fractured, it had not shattered beyond repair. When the porridge was ready, she ladled it into bowls and passed one to the boy, her hand steadying as she met his hopeful gaze. In that moment, the warmth of her act, humble though it seemed, felt like the first flicker of light rekindling an ember in her chest. Later, after the boy scampered away to tend his chores, Eleanor lingered by the hearth once more, her eyes tracing the contours of the stones as though searching for a map to guide her through the wilderness of her grief. She reached out and closed the hearth's heavy iron grill, symbolically barring the emptiness within but also safeguarding a space for possibility. The morning sun, now streaming through the window, painted the room in a glow that was neither harsh nor forgiving, but simply honest. She stood between the cold heart of the hearth and the warmth of the world beyond her walls, breathing in the mingled scent of hearth smoke, damp earth, and the faint tang of iron from the battlefields her son had left behind. In that convergence of elements, fire and stone, memory and hope, Eleanor felt the fragile stirrings of something akin to resolve. She would carry the letter with her as a talisman of love. She would honor her son's memory in each act of kindness and in every gentle whisper of the wind through the trees. And though the path ahead would be shadowed by the echo of his absence, she would step forward into bright unknown of each new dawn, guided by the promise that emerged from the ashes on her hearth. Twilight settled over the village like a velvet shawl drawn gently over the shoulders of the earth, softening edges and muffling sound, transforming the world into a painting done in hues of ash and lavender. Eleanor stood at the edge of the churchyard, her black skirts brushing against the tops of frost-stiffened grass, her breath rising in pale clouds as though her grief had become visible in the cooling air. The grave lay freshly turned before her, the soil a deep, unsettled brown against the fading green of the hillside. It bore no headstone, only a small wooden marker hammered into the earth with shaking hand by the village gravedigger, a man who had known Eleanor since she was a girl, and who said nothing as she stood there, unmoving, while he finished his task. The marker was plain and undecorated, and though she had told herself she would carve his name upon it with her own knife, her hands refused the labor. It did not feel real. The ground had opened too easily, too quickly, as though it were always meant to swallow him. Around her, the murmurs of the gathered villagers came and went like wind through tall grass, soft, hesitant, careful not to disturb the fragile veil of silence that clung to Eleanor like a second skin. They'd come in small groups. The baker would watch her boy grow tall on warm loaves and strawberry tarts, the midwife who had once taught her how to swaddle him, the blacksmith who had sharpened the boy's wooden sword long ago when he had dreamed of glory. Their faces were drawn, their voices muted by the solemnity of the moment, and yet Eleanor felt their sorrow as something distant, as though they stood behind thick glass, their grief thin and impersonal beside the hollow ache that pulsed inside her like a second heartbeat. Their hands reached for her, gently touching her shoulder, her arm, pressing offerings of condolence and sympathy into her hands. But she could not hold on to them. They slipped away like water through her fingers, ungraspable and fleeting, unable to anchor her in this sudden, terrible absence. The priest had spoken a few words earlier, verses about rest and peace and eternal reward, but Eleanor remembered none of them. She had heard the cadence of his voice, but the meaning had not pierced the fog that lay thick around her mind. Her thoughts were fixed instead on the last time she had seen her son, standing at the gate of their cottage, pack slung over one shoulder, trying to smile in the face of her breaking heart. He had looked older in his uniform, more solemn than she had ever known him to be, and yet there had been a brightness in his eyes that defied the gravity of his farewell. He had kissed her cheek and pressed something into her hand, a scrap of cloth from his childhood blanket, worn soft with age and folded with reverence, and told her that he would carry her love like a shield into the unknown. Now she carried his memory in its place, heavy and cold, like the iron pot she once hung over the fire. As the last of the villagers drifted away, their steps slow and uncertain, Eleanor remained rooted to the spot, unwilling to leave the patch of earth that now held the remains of her only child. The wind picked up, rustling the bare branches of nearby oaks, and with it came the scent of damp soil and withered leaves. She inhaled deeply, willing herself to feel something other than the raw numbness that had taken hold of her since the messenger arrived. That boy, no older than her son had been when he first chased butterflies through the orchard, had stood awkwardly in her doorway, hat in hand, eyes downcast, holding the folded notice as though it burned him. He had not known what to say. No one ever did, but it hadn't mattered. The truth had already rooted itself in her belly long before he spoke. She had known the moment the wind stilled and the birdsong stopped, when the candle she had lit in the window sputtered out for no reason. Some part of her soul had already begun mourning before the words were said aloud. Now, as dusk deepened and the shadows grew long, Eleanor knelt beside the grave, her knees pressing into the wet ground, soaking to the worn fabric of her dress. The cold bit into her bones, but she welcomed it, embraced the ache as a necessary part of her penance. In her hand, she held a small bundle wrapped in linen, lavender and rosemary, dried petals from the garden they had tended together, a scrap of ribbon from his childhood tunic, and the carved wooden sparrow he had made her one spring when he was 9. She pressed the bundle into the soil, burying it beside the marker as though by gifting the earth a piece of herself, she could somehow reach him in whatever place now held his spirit. The act felt sacred, desperate, and wholly insufficient. Her fingers lingered in the dirt, drawing circles, tracing letters she could not bring herself to speak aloud. "My love," she whispered finally, the words catching in her throat, as brittle and dry as a leaf that scattered across the ground around her. "My boy." The sun dipped below the far ridge, casting the hills in shadow, and with it came the first true chill night. Eleanor remained still, wrapped in her shawl, her eyes fixed on a small mound of earth that marked the boundary between life and memory. She remembered him as an infant, the weight of him against her breast, his breath warm and even. She remembered his first steps, the way he had fallen and giggled, clapping his hands in triumph. She remembered his teenage defiance, the slammed doors, the silence that sometimes stretched for days. But always, beneath the stubbornness and the growing independence, there had been love, raw, unfiltered, and pure. He had been the anchor of her world, the sun around which every part of her life revolved. Without him, the sky itself seemed unsure where to hang its stars. A sudden gust of wind swept through the yard, scattering the petals from the graveside bundle and lifting the hem of her skirt. Eleanor shivered and stood slowly, her knees stiff from kneeling too long, her hands dusted with soil. The village bell rang out the hour in the distance, 7 low chimes that echoed across the hills like a call to prayer. She took a step back, then another, unsure how to leave him there alone. But the grave was no longer just a hole in the earth. It had become a threshold, a place where the living and the lost might still touch, however briefly. She placed one hand on the wooden marker and whispered a blessing, one she had not used since she was a child frightened of storms. "May the wind carry you gently, may the sky watch over you, and may your dreams be full of home." She said it twice, then a third time, sealing it into the twilight as if to bind it to the night air. As she walked back down the path that led to the churchyard gates and into the village, Eleanor did not look behind her. She could not. Her spine felt as though it would snap under the weight of another farewell. The cobblestones beneath her boots were slick with evening dew, and her steps were slow, measured, as though she were relearning how to move through a world that no longer made sense. The lights in the windows of the cottages she passed flickered with warm gold, and for the first time she noticed how the smell of hearth smoke made her feel hollow. Each home was a small flame burning against the night, a reminder of lives that continued, of stories still unfolding, while hers had unraveled into silence. When she reached her own cottage, the door creaked open beneath her hand, and the familiar scent of dried herbs and beeswax wrapped around her like a faded memory. The fire had burned low, and she stirred it back to life mechanically, adding logs until the orange glow chased away the darkness in the corners of the room. She stood for a moment in the quiet, her hands outstretched toward the warmth, and allowed herself to cry. There was no sound to her weeping, no gasping sobs, no broken wails, only the silent overflow of everything she had held in for too long. The tears carved slow, aching paths down her cheeks, falling onto the stones at her feet, where they disappeared without trace. Later, when the fire had settled into a steady rhythm and the cottage was dark but for its flickering light, Eleanor retrieved the folded uniform that had been delivered alongside the letter, still sealed in a military satchel. She laid it gently across the table, smoothing the sleeves with her palms, her eyes catching on the stitched initials near the collar. It smelled faintly of sweat and smoke, and something else she couldn't name, something that broke her all over again. She pressed her forehead to the fabric and stayed that way for a long time, breathing him in, anchoring herself in the remnants of his presence. Outside, the wind continued to hum through the trees, and somewhere an owl called into the night, its voice low and mournful. Eleanor sat beside the fire with her hands in her lap, the uniform still draped across the table like a memory made flesh. She knew there would be many more nights like this one, each a slow unraveling, each a quiet reckoning. But for now, she let the silence fill the room, her grief companion she no longer feared. She was alone, but not empty. The earth had taken her son, but not the love that bore him into the world, nor the memory of the boy he had been, nor the hope that in some unseen place he walked again beneath the stars, whole and unafraid. Spring arrived like a whispered promise, soft and hesitant, tiptoeing across the frostbitten fields with green fingertips and the scent of rain-soaked earth. In the orchard behind Eleanor's cottage, the gnarled apple trees began to bud again, their branches heavy with new life that pushed its way forward without waiting for permission. The snowmelt fed the soil in quiet rivers beneath the ground, and even the cracked stone path that led from her front door to the well seemed less burdened, less weary, as though time itself had decided, if only briefly, to ease its weight upon the land. Yet within the cottage, where light passed slowly through linen curtains of color bone, Eleanor still moved like a shadow, precise, deliberate, unchanged in the face of seasons that dared to forget what she could not. Grief had reshaped her from the inside out, refining her gestures into something sharper and more economical, carving silences where laughter used to bloom. Each morning she rose before the sun, not from habit, but from a compulsion that bordered on ritual. Her sleep remained fractured, haunted by dreams of her son walking away from her down long roads that never curved, his back a vanishing shape she could never quite call back. But it was not the dreams that drove her from bed. It was the loom, set in the far corner of the cottage, where the light from the eastern windows struck most true. It stood as both relic and refuge, a patient machine that received the ache of her hands without question. Her father had given her the loom when she was 16, its frame sanded smooth, its parts crafted with care by an aging carpenter who had insisted it would outlast them all. And it had. It stood through famine and flood, through a husband's long illness and slow passing, through a son's childhood and then his war. It had survived with the same quiet determination that now sustained her, and the sharp clack of the shuttle against its beam. Eleanor found a rhythm that held her together when speech could not. Her weaving had always been steady, but now it carried a different kind of urgency, a devotion bordering on reverence. She no longer wove for market, nor for the pleasure of embroidery or profit. Each piece she made now was bound to a name. Some widow from the village who came knocking with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands, Some mother who could no longer bear the silence of an empty table. Eleanor listened as they spoke, sometimes only a few words, sometimes none at all, and then she set to work. She wove their losses into shawls and blankets, each one stitched with hidden symbols, forgotten flowers, or lines of poetry pressed between weft and warp like sacred spells. They never asked her what the patterns meant, but she knew they saw it. They would run their hands across the linen, as though feeling the contours of something invisible, some sorrow made tangible by thread. On one particular morning in early April, Eleanor sat at the loom with the door cracked open, letting in the scent of wet grass and wild daffodils. Her hands moved deftly across the warped threads, pulling the shuttle through the frame with the ease of long habit, though today she worked more slowly, each pass deliberate. She was weaving a blanket for a girl who had lost her husband in the same battle that had taken her son. The girl had been barely 20, with a belly rounded by new life and a silence that vibrated like a tuning fork. Eleanor had seen something familiar in her, the stunned, disbelieving stillness of someone whose entire world had shifted out of place in a single breath. The blanket she wove for her was made of ivory and pale blue threads, soft to the touch, with a border that held the faint shape of forget-me-nots. It was not meant to bring comfort so much as to say, "You are not alone. There is still warmth to be held, even if you must hold it for yourself." Sometimes, when the light grew golden in the late afternoon, Eleanor would set down her shuttle and move to the garden, where she knelt among the lavender and rosemary, coaxing life from the soil with hands still raw from thread and splinter. She spoke to the plants the way she once spoke to her son, softly, with affection and instruction, sometimes with laughter she did not know she still possessed. The garden had once been his playground, the place he built forts from fallen branches and caught beetles in glass jars. Now it was sacred ground, not for his memory alone, but for the living, breathing hope that things still grew. She clipped stems of herbs and bundled them to dry in the rafters, their scent rising in the evenings to meet the scent of smoke from a hearth. The cottage smelled of rosemary and linen, of dust and labor and time, of all the things a life could still be built from, even in the shadow of loss. Her neighbors began to notice the change, though none spoke of it directly. They remarked instead on the beauty of her work, on the way her garden flourished, on the warmth of her bread when she sent loaves wrapped in cloth to the widow with a broken hip or the old man with no children left. Eleanor accepted their gratitude with grace, but she kept her gaze steady and her heart guarded. It was not generosity that moved her. It was a need to keep her hands from stillness. She had learned that stillness was where the ache lived loudest, where memory pressed most insistently against the ribs. So she worked, she wove, she planted, and in doing so, she kept from falling into the chasm that yawned just beneath the surface of her days. At night, when the fire was banked and the cottage was cloaked in quiet, she would sit by the window and run her fingers over the edge of her son's last letter, the paper now softened by repeated touch. She did not read it each time. She knew it by heart, every word a lantern in the dark. But she liked the feel of it, the texture, the weight, the way it folded into her palm as though it belonged there. Sometimes she would speak aloud the final line. "I long for the day I return to you." It was not a hope, not a question. It was simply a tether to the boy he had been, to the love that still lingered like a pulse beneath everything she touched. One evening, in the quiet that followed a storm, Eleanor lit a single candle and pulled out a length of linen she kept hidden beneath her bed. It was a special piece, dyed the color of twilight, the edges unfinished, the surface bare. She had saved it, uncertain for what, until that moment. With careful, reverent motions, she began to embroider it with small, precise stitches. The shape of a sparrow in flight, a line of mountains he had once drawn for her as a child, a flowering branch curved like a lullaby. It was not for sale nor for gifting. It was for the boy who no longer walked her orchard, who no longer called her name. It was for the part of her that had been carved away and buried, and for the part that had survived in spite of it. As her needle moved through the cloth, Eleanor felt the weight in her chest shift, subtle but sure. It was not that the grief had lessened, nor that her son's absence stung any less. It was that, through each act of making, of tending, of remembering, she had begun to gather herself again, to stitch together a version of life that could hold both sorrow and purpose without unraveling. She no longer searched for meaning in every rustle of the leaves, no longer listened for footsteps that would never return. But neither did she turn away from those echoes when they came. She had learned to let them be part of her, not an enemy to be banished, but a companion to walk beside. By the time spring reached its peak, the orchard in full bloom and the fields humming with bees, Eleanor stood at her door each morning not in expectation, but in readiness. The world had changed, and so had she. The path to healing had not been a single road, but a winding trail made of small labors, quiet offerings, and the unspoken language of the hands. And while she knew the ache would return, perhaps with the next letter delivered or the next grave dug, she also knew she could meet it with something more than silence. She could meet it with thread, with soil, with the steady, resilient beating of a heart that had learned to make space for loss and love in equal measure. The morning had begun like any other, veiled in the soft hush of mist rising off the earth and the low hum of bees returning to the lavender Eleanor had coaxed into bloom beside the cottage. The fire had been lit before the sky fully brightened, and bread had already been kneaded and tucked beneath a linen cloth to rise. The scent of damp wood and yeast mingled in the warm air of her kitchen. The room bathed in that same gold-toned stillness that had settled over her home since grief had first taken root there. She was seated at her loom again, weaving a narrow strip of fabric for a morning sash requested by the miller's wife, when a knock came, not loud or frantic, but hesitant, like the tapping of a branch against glass during a calm storm. She paused mid-stitch, her fingers still wrapped around the shuttle, and listened. Another knock followed, barely louder than the first, then silence. No bird song, no breeze, just a thick breath of early spring lingering on the threshold. She wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the room, opening the door with the quiet caution of someone for whom the world had ceased to deliver anything unexpected but sorrow. Standing there in the pale light was a boy, thin, unwashed, and no more than 10, though hunger and fear had aged his eyes in ways that numbers could not convey. His clothes clung to him like wet paper, oversized and patched with carelessness, the sleeves of his coat frayed and too long, the hem dragging with damp mud. His cheeks were smudged with dirt and his lips were cracked, but it was his eyes that held her still, wide and dark and sunken with the kind of silence that had lived too long inside a child. He didn't speak. He simply looked up at her as if unsure whether she was real or she might turn to smoke and vanish like the warm meals he dreamed about. Eleanor stared at him for a moment, her heart catching in her chest in a way she did not expect. She had not prepared for this. Her life had narrowed into quiet repetition, spinning, kneading, harvesting, weaving, its perimeter defined by routine and absence. But here stood something foreign and immediate, a child not born of her, not lost to her, but needing something she did not yet know she had left to give. She stepped aside without a word and gestured him in, watching as he crossed the threshold like a stray animal unsure of whether the door might shut behind him with cruelty. He lingered just inside, glancing around with the wary eye of someone who had been punished for standing too close to warmth. Without asking his name, without pressing him for a reason, she fetched a dry towel and placed it in his hands. He accepted it with slow, uncertain fingers, his eyes fixed on hers, as if waiting for permission to exist. She turned back toward the hearth and ladled warm broth from the pot into a small wooden bowl, then set it on the table along with a hunk of bread she tore from the still steaming loaf. He ate with the quiet desperation of someone who had grown used to shame, tearing the bread in pieces so small they barely needed chewing, as though to stretch the act of eating into something sacred. Eleanor didn't speak, and neither did he. They remained like that for a time, her seated across from him with her hands folded in her lap, him hunched over the bowl, each breath rising between them like mist over thawed ground. Eventually, when the color returned to his cheeks and his shoulders dropped from their tight brace, he leaned back in a chair, drowsiness beginning to take hold. Eleanor watched as his eyelids fluttered, and she fetched a quilt from the chest beneath the window, the one she had stitched during a sleepless winter, filled with patches from her son's old shirts. It was a rough thing, not delicate, but strong and warm. She draped it over him gently, and the boy's fingers clutched its edge before sleep claimed him, curling inward like the petals of a flower retreating at dusk. She sat beside him as he dozed, her gaze drifting from his hollow face to the patchwork that covered him, wondering at the strange symmetry of this moment. How something made in sorrow could now become a shelter for someone else's need. That night, When he awoke to the sound of rain drumming against the roof, he did not speak, but she found him standing near the hearth, the quilt still clutched around his shoulders, staring into flames as if they could explain the ache in his chest. Eleanor placed a stool beside the fire and sat down slowly, not too close, and reached for her knitting. He joined her in silence, and they remained that way until the fire burned low, the room aglow in a quiet too complete to be called empty. The boy did not ask to stay. She did not ask him to leave. It was as though both had arrived at some wordless understanding, one shaped not by agreement but by recognition, that something broken in each of them answered to the other, not in speech but in nearness. Over the days that followed, the boy began to emerge from the shell he wore like armor. Eleanor learned his name in fragments, not from his mouth, but from a tag sewn inside his shirt, letters barely legible beneath the grime. His name was Tom. She learned, too, with careful observation, the language of his hunger, not just for food, but for belonging. He followed her in small ways, mimicking her movements as she planted seeds, watching how she sliced apples or gathered eggs from the hens. He never asked questions, but his eyes drank in everything, and Eleanor began to speak to him not because he demanded it, but because she could no longer bear the sound of silence. She told him the names of the herbs they dried together, explained the purpose of each tool in her weaving kit, described the way clouds could warn of frost or flood. Her voice was quiet, measured, unhurried, and though he never interrupted her, she could feel his curiosity gathering at the edges, like rain collecting in the corners of a dry field. One afternoon, he surprised her by placing a bowl of milk in front of the hearth where the barn cat liked to sleep. It was not the act itself that caught her breath, but the care with which he had done it, his small hand cradling the bowl to keep it from spilling, the way he had waited to see if the cat would come. She saw something of her son in him then, not his features or voice, but that same yearning to be gentle in a world that often punished tenderness. Later, she found a crude figure carved from softwood resting on the edge of the windowsill. It had no clear shape, no detail, but its presence was unmistakably an offering, something made with thought and time. She picked it up and held it in her palm, feeling the ridges where his fingers had worried the surface smooth, and felt something shift inside her, a loosening, like the first thaw of winter ice. As the weeks passed and the seasons tipped slowly toward summer, Tom grew into the corners of her life like ivy against stone, subtle, steady, unrelenting. He spoke more now, in short bursts, his voice raspy from disuse but his eyes brighter. He asked about her son one evening, haltingly, after she had told him the story of a hawk that had once nested near the orchard. She looked at him for a long time before answering, then told him everything. How he had laughed when the wind pulled at his hat, how he had once stayed awake all night to guard a nest of robin's eggs from a prowling fox, how he had gone to war not for glory, but because he believed he should protect those he loved. Her voice broke only once, and when it did, Tom reached for her hand and held in silence, the gesture fragile and enormous all at once. By the end of that summer, his coat had been mended, his cheeks fuller, his eyes less wary. He had his own blanket now, stitched from scraps they collected together, and his own small shelf in the pantry for things he favored. Dried apples, a jar of honey, a smooth stone he claimed had the power to grant wishes if you whispered to it on the right kind of night. Eleanor let him believe it, just as she let herself believe that something, somewhere, had seen her sorrow and sent this boy not as a replacement, but as a reminder that love was not a single thread to be severed, but a tapestry that could be rewoven, not by painful knot. And when she rose in the mornings now, when the hearth glowed and the steam from the tea curled upward like a blessing, she felt the change not in thunderous revelation, but in the quiet constancy of another set of footsteps across her floor, the sound of water being poured into a basin, the soft murmur of a child humming to himself without fear. The world had not righted itself. Her son had not returned, but the air no longer tasted of absence alone. There was sweetness again, subtle, tremulous, but real, and in that sweetness, Eleanor found the strength to open her door each day, not just for Tom, but for the life still waiting to be lived. By the time the 5th year since her son's burial passed like a shadow across the face of the calendar, Eleanor had ceased counting the seasons in numbers and instead measured them by the movements of wind through the orchard, by the reach of sunlight across the floorboards, by the way Tom's laughter, brighter now, anchored in belonging, rose in harmony with the morning's birdsong. Grief had not left her, nor had she asked it to. It had taken up quiet residence inside her, occupying the same rooms as memory, folded between the tasks of her daily life like an invisible companion who no longer needed to announce its presence. But something had changed in her since the boy's arrival, something both slow and undeniable, like water gradually softening stone. The ache had learned to make space for warmth. The silence had grown less sharp, replaced by the rustle of growing things, the hum of distant bees, the sound of Tom reading aloud in a halting voice by firelight with his thumb pressed carefully along the words. The cottage no longer felt like a reliquary for sorrow, but a cradle for quiet persistence. And yet, beneath it all, there was still a weight she carried alone, a question left unanswered, a door unopened in her mind that led always back to the last time she saw her son walk away. It was during late summer when the first whisper came, as fragile and wild as dust lifted by a dry wind. Tom had returned from the village early, having been sent with eggs and herbs to trade for soap and beeswax, and as he set down the basket on the table, he hesitated, just long enough that Eleanor, who had learned to read his moods the way sailors read clouds, looked up from her stitching and asked what troubled him. He shrugged, reluctant to say, but after a pause, the words came out all at once. That the butcher's apprentice had told him of a traveler who passed through 2 nights earlier, a soldier missing an eye and carrying only a single name on his tongue, the name of Eleanor's son. At first, the word struck her not as possibility but as intrusion, a wound reopened without consent. She asked for no details, only sent Tom outside to tend to the rosemary, and remained seated at the table long after the light had begun to fade, her needle motionless in her lap. She told herself it was foolishness. Rumors, boys' talk, people said strange things to fill silences they didn't understand. And yet, once spoken, the idea rooted itself like nettle in her chest, sharp and difficult to ignore. Over the following weeks, the whispers began to multiply, carried on the lips of travelers and tinkers, woven into the market's idle conversations like errant threads. A man matching her son's general description had been seen near the marshland coast, walking with a limp and wrapped in a soldier's cloak that bore no emblem. He asked for nothing. He offered no name. But the old woman who sold turnips swore she recognized his voice from the years before the war. Another claimed he'd been spotted outside the chapel in the next town over, lighting a candle and walking away before the priest could offer him a blessing. Each story was different, but each bore the same refrain. A man alone, broken but moving, searching for something he would not name. Eleanor did not allow herself hope. She had buried him. She had stood in the cold earth as they lowered the box, felt the finality in her bones. She had survived the years by shaping her grief into something useful. Hope now felt dangerous. It felt like striking a match beside a dry barn, flickering and impossible to contain. And yet at night, she found herself listening to the wind for footsteps that never came, staring too long into the fire, holding the last letter he wrote her against her chest until sleep overtook her. One evening, as the sky flamed with the last light of a long day, Tom brought her a folded scrap of paper he had found wedged between the fence rails along the road, left perhaps by a passing peddler or lost from someone's satchel. The writing was unfamiliar, but the words made her breath catch. It was a prayer, simple, unadorned, written in a soldier's hand. The phrasing was sparse but unmistakable. For the mother who waited, it read, "For the boy I could not save, forgive me." Eleanor sat long into the night with the scrap resting in her lap, not knowing whose hand had written it, or whether it was meant for her at all. It didn't matter. It felt like something buried beneath stone was shifting, not breaking free. Not yet, but moving nonetheless. The dreams returned in fragments. She would see her son standing just beyond the orchard's edge, turned slightly away, his features blurred by shadow and distance. She would call out, but no sound would leave her throat. He would lift his hand, as if to wave or to bless, and then he would vanish with the first note of dawn bird song. Each morning she rose with the ache of those dreams stitched into her spine, aching and unrelenting. Her work at the loom became slower, more careful. She found herself weaving without intention, as though her hands were trying to speak in a language she had forgotten. She stitched familiar symbols into her cloth without meaning to, her son's initials, the spiral pattern he had once drawn in the sand behind the house, the shape of the ridge where he used to perch to watch the sunset. It was not memory, but something else, an echo maybe, or a call sent out across the unmeasured distance between what was lost and what still waited to be found. She did not speak of these things to Tom, not fully. He watched her carefully in those weeks, as though sensing some slow transformation in the way she moved. In the quiet hours she spent staring into the trees, or walking the orchard paths with her hand brushing against the trunks of the oldest apple trees. One morning he asked her directly, his voice uncertain, if she believed the soldier they spoke of could be the one she mourned. Eleanor did not answer him at first. She turned instead to the window, where sunlight spilled across the floor like water from a broken jug, and said only that there were some questions a heart could not survive asking too loudly. Tom said nothing more, but in the days that followed he lingered near her more than usual, offering to carry her baskets, tending the chickens without being told, watching her in the quiet way of someone who had learned that love was often silent and folded in small actions. As autumn edged closer, the trees began to thin, and the air took on that specific sharpness that smelled of drying leaves and far-off smoke. Eleanor found herself drawn to the chapel at the edge of the village, a place she had not visited since the day of the burial. It was not piety that called her back, but proximity. She walked the path in silence, her steps slow but unwavering, and when she reached the old wooden door, she sat outside on a stone bench and closed her eyes. She did not pray. Instead, she listened to the wind, to the creak of trees, to the far-off hammering of a blacksmith finishing his last task before sundown. She stayed until the stars began to prick the sky, and then she returned home, where the hearth glowed and Tom had left a bowl of broth warming for her, the old quilt folded neatly across her chair. It was in that season of half-certainties and unanswered questions that Eleanor allowed herself to speak his name aloud again, not as memory, but as presence. She whispered into the fabric she wove, hummed it beneath her breath as she shelled peas, tucked into the folds of a letter she never sent. She did not know if he was dead or alive, if the grave she had wept over held his body, or only the story others had given her. But she knew at last that the not knowing had become its own kind of truth, a space she could live inside without collapsing. The past no longer held her like a vice, but curved instead around her days like a scar that ached with weather changes but no longer split open. And when she stood beneath the rowan tree planted over his grave and watched the wind scatter its red-tinged leaves, she did not feel betrayal in the rumors or fear in the not knowing. She felt possibility, fragile, distant, but present. In time, the whispers would fade again, swallowed by the turning world and the forgetfulness of strangers. But Eleanor would remember, not because she needed to, but because it had become a part of how she moved through the world, watching for shadows in the orchard, listening to voices in the wind, feeling the pulse of her own heart respond to the smallest shifts in light. And though she still lit a candle in the window each night, the gesture had changed. It was no longer an act of mourning alone. It was an invitation, a signal to any soul still wandering in the dark, any heart lost and trying to find its way home. And perhaps someday that flame would be seen. Perhaps it would draw someone back across the years and distances and silence. Perhaps not. But either way, Eleanor would be waiting, not with expectation, but with arms that had learned how to hold what remained. The 7th anniversary of his burial arrived on a morning veiled in rain. It was not a downpour, but persistent mist that settled in the fold of the land, softening the outlines of fences and rooftops, turning the fields into watercolor. The village, always hushed on this day out of collective, unspoken respect for Eleanor, moved slowly beneath a sky the color of pewter. She had long since stopped marking the date on calendars, but her body remembered. Something that ached behind her ribs, the dull pressure in her temples, the way the light itself seemed thinner, more brittle. She moved through her morning routine in silence, her hands working without thought as she fetched water from the well, stoked the hearth, and swept the front step clean of leaves blown down in the night. Tom was away at the neighbor's farm, helping repair a fence line, and Eleanor found the quiet of the empty house both unbearable and necessary. It gave her room to feel the weight of the day, to touch the raw edge of memory, without needing to explain herself. She lit a candle just after breakfast and placed it in the window, not out of habit or ritual, but because she could not bear to sit in the dark. The flame flickered faintly. Its reflection caught in the warped pane of glass, and for a long time she simply stood and watched it, her arms folded against the chill in the air. She thought his hands, how they felt wrapped around hers the day he left, how warm and certain they had been even as his voice faltered. She remembered the way he had turned back one last time at the bend in the road, lifting his hand in a wave that looked like both goodbye and apology, though he had never said for what. She had replayed that final moment in her mind so many times it had taken on the weight of a dream, distorted and uncertain. But today it returned with aching clarity, and she found herself gripping the edge of the table to stay upright beneath its sudden force. The rain persisted through the morning, turning the path outside to slick mud and streaking the windows with long, silent tears. Eleanor settled by the hearth with her mending, trying to lose herself in the small, repetitive motions of needle and thread, but her eyes strayed too often to the door. She told herself she was only watching the weather, only waiting to see if Tom would return before the worst of the storm arrived. But the truth lingered like a shadow at the back of her thoughts. She was waiting, not for someone specific, not for something she could name, but for a shift, a sign, an ending or a beginning, some answer to the years of not knowing that had spread through her life like ivy, beautiful and invasive, climbing over everything until it became a part of the structure. It was just after the village bell tolled noon, soft and slow through the fog, that she heard it. The knock. 3 quiet raps, deliberate and close. Not the hurried pounding of someone seeking shelter from the storm, not the light tapping of a neighbor with eggs or news, but a knock that asked for something deeper than entry. Eleanor froze where she sat, her breath caught halfway between silence and sound, her needle suspended above the seam of an old work shirt. For a moment, she wondered if she had imagined it, if the wind had shifted some branch against the wall, or if memory had finally begun to speak aloud. But then it came again, firmer now, the sound unmistakable. She rose slowly, every movement carrying the weight of years, and crossed the room with the caution of someone approaching a wound they had learned to live around. Her hand paused on the latch. She took a single breath, shallow, uncertain, then opened the door. The man who stood on the threshold was soaked through, his cloak heavy with rain and streaked with mud, the hood pulled low over his brow. He was tall, though stooped to exhaustion or pain, and his boots left deep impressions in the softened earth behind him. His face was shadowed, but what you could see of it was unfamiliar and yet not strange. There was something in the tilt of his jaw, the shape of his mouth, the stillness of his posture. He did not speak at once. He removed his hood slowly, with trembling fingers, and looked up into her eyes. For a moment, the world narrowed to that gaze. His face was older than she remembered, leaner, with lines carved deep around his mouth, and a scar running down the side of his cheek, like a river through dry land. One of his eyes, his right, was clouded blind. His hair, one sun-warmed brown, was streaked with gray. But the left eye, that eye was his, her son's, and it was watching her now with such unbearable tenderness, such naked guilt, that her knees nearly gave beneath her. "Eleanor," he said, and it was not her name he meant, but the plea wrapped inside it. She did not answer. Her hand fell from the doorframe, and for a moment she simply stared, unsure if her mind had turned cruel and conjured him from some long-held dream. She looked past him, searching for a sign, for proof, for witness. But there was only the mist and the quiet road behind him. He was alone. He stepped forward once, then stopped. He held something in his hands, a small bundle wrapped in cloth, soaked and clinging to whatever was inside. With great care, he opened it and held out its contents. A ring, her husband's signet, the one she had given their son when he turned 18, the one he had sworn never to take off. "I kept it," he said, and his voice was rough with disuse, the syllables worn thin with longing. "They said I died. I let them." The word struck her like a wave. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The world tilted. The fire inside the house crackled softly behind her, and the rain whispered against the eaves. But none of it mattered. She took a step forward, her hand reaching without thought, and touched his face. His skin was cold. "Real. You were buried," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I stood at your grave." "I know," he said. It wasn't me. Not fully. I was taken after the battle. Captured. They didn't know my name. I didn't give it. I couldn't. I thought you'd be safe for believing I was gone. She made a sound then. Not a cry, not a word, but something caught between the two, a sound that cracked open the ears and spilled everything she had buried at his feet. And he, her son, not dead, not lost, stepped to the threshold without waiting for permission and caught her as she fell into his arms. They sank together to the floor just inside the doorway, the fire casting long shadows across the stone, the door still open to the mist and the wind. She held his face in her hands and wept, not for what had been lost, but for what had returned. And he wept too, silently, his body trembling beneath her touch as though he had been waiting for this embrace longer than he dared admit. Tom returned later to find them there, the door ajar, the candle still burning in the window. He paused in the yard, unsure of what he saw, then stepped back into the shadows, understanding that the moment was not his to enter. From where he stood, he could see only the outline of the man and the woman locked together in silence, the fire flickering behind them, casting a warmth that reached all the way into the cold corners of his own heart. Inside, Eleanor finally pulled back just enough to look into her son's face again, and for the first time in 7 years, she smiled, a slow, aching thing that rose not from joy but from the deepest well of sorrow finally allowed to find release. She cupped his cheek, her thumb brushing over the scar, and said his name, not the name given to the stone that marked the wrong grave, not the name whispered in dreams, but the name she had once sung to him beside the hearth, the name spoken with love and salt and sun. And he answered, not with words, but with the way his hand found hers again, steady and unafraid. The storm outside began to lift. The mist thinned, and the candle in the window flickered not with longing, but with welcome. They did not speak much in the hours that followed. Words, one so desperately yearned for, now felt too narrow for the vastness of what had come undone inside that small cottage. He sat by the fire, still soaked through despite the warmth, his shoulders hunched beneath the borrowed quilt as though the years had taught him to brace against comfort as if it were another form of pain. Eleanor moved quietly around him, her hand sure but shaken, pouring tea into the clay mug he used as a boy. The glaze chipped at the rim, the handle repaired long ago with wire and care. When she passed it to him, her fingers brushed his and they lingered, not because of hesitation, but because after so long apart, the weight of a single human touch was almost too much to bear. She watched his hands as he drank, noting the small tremors, the scars she did not recognize, the bone-deep weariness in a way he held even the smallest thing like it might vanish if he loosened his grip. He had changed. It was undeniable, not merely in his face or form, though both had shifted in ways that could not be undone, but in the way silence moved through him. There was a guardedness there now, not born of secrecy, but of survival. He was quieter than before, his words few and considered, as though each syllable cost him something. He answered her questions gently when she asked, but always without embellishment, offering truth in fragments, not narratives. She learned bit by bit that he had been taken prisoner during the battle, not killed, as the notice had claimed, but mistaken for dead and left among the fallen, until night covered the field and enemy hands dragged him away. He had been held for nearly 2 years in a camp across the mountains, nameless and half-starved, traded once in a prisoner exchange that never reached his side of the war again. By the time he escaped, the war had changed its borders, and home had become a memory folded into the dark corners of his mind, a place too far to name aloud. He had wandered, not aimlessly, but without direction. He moved from town to town, working for bread, sleeping in barns or under hedgerows, his uniform discarded piece by piece until he was no longer even a soldier by appearance, just another weary man carrying something he could not put down. When he reached the coast, he had stopped, staring at the sea for 2 days before turning inland again. He had tried to write once, but his hand had shaken too badly, and the ink had run in the rain. And always there had been the shame, the bone-deep shame of being alive when others were not, of returning after she had buried him, of imagining her carrying his death in her hands while he still walked. Eleanor listened, not with the hunger of a mother desperate for answers, but with the stillness of someone who understood that some stories could only be spoken around, not through. She asked what she could bear to hear, and she did not press when his voice failed him. She noticed how his eyes flicked toward the corners of the room, as if measuring how long he might stay. She noticed, too, that he did not look at the door. That meant something. At night, she laid another blanket beside the hearth where he slept, his body too restless for the bed upstairs. She did not ask why he needed the floor, nor did she question the way he sometimes muttered in sleep, his limbs flinching as though dodging ghosts. She only waited until he quieted, then added another log to fire, listening to the rhythm of his breath like she had when he was a boy, curled against the wall after fevers or storms. On the third morning, he asked about the grave. They stood in the orchard where the trees were heavy with ripening fruit, the rowan tree casting long shadows over the stones beneath it. She told him how the army had sent word, how a coffin had arrived 2 months later, closed and sealed, no viewing allowed. She had never opened it. She had wanted to, but the priest had told her not to desecrate the dead. She had chosen to believe it was him. Not because she was convinced, but because to believe otherwise would have unraveled her. He knelt before the marker, fingers tracing the grain of the wood where his name had been etched in her hand, the letters worn smooth by time and weather. He did not cry. He only bowed his head. And in the long hush that followed, Eleanor saw something unspoken pass between the living and the dead, some wordless exchange of sorrow and permission. "I wasn't ready," he said quietly, "to be alive again. I didn't know how to come home." She nodded, her hand resting on his shoulder. "You came," she replied, and in that, everything that mattered was contained. After that morning, things began to settle, though not into ease. There was no swift return to what had been, no seamless stitching of a life torn open. Their days became slow negotiations of presence, each hour shaped by patience and recalibration. He helped Tom with chores in the garden, and though the boy watched him with cautious admiration, Eleanor knew he was also waiting to be sure this man who bore resemblance to a myth would not vanish like one. Her son never spoke down to the boy, never made himself more than he was. When Tom asked what war felt like, he answered without bravado. "Like forgetting who you are," he said, "and spending years trying to remember." It was in the evenings that the unraveling truly began. They would sit by the fire, Eleanor spinning flax, Tom curled with a book, and her son staring into flame as though searching for a thread. One night, he spoke of the men who didn't come back. He did not name them, only described their habits. The one who whistled before sleep, the one who carved tiny birds from peach pits, the one who died with his hand in his pocket, clutching a note he never had time to send. Eleanor said little during these stories. She only listened, her eyes on the fibers in her hand, and let the weight of the truth settle between them like ashes. When she asked what he needed, what might help, he looked at her with the hesitation of someone not used to being asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "A place to belong, maybe. Somewhere I don't have to explain why I'm still breathing." She told him he already had it, not because it was easy, not because she had forgotten the years of mourning, but because love had not died with the name chiseled into that grave. It had changed, it had bent, but it had not broken. One afternoon, he returned from town with a small book wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to Tom, awkward and shy, and said only, "You'll like this one." The boy opened it carefully and smiled, the cover worn, the pages soft with age. That night, he read aloud from it, and Eleanor sat back in her chair and watched them, the man and the child, both shaped by loss and yet capable of warmth. She saw, in the flickering light, something beginning to repair, not perfectly, not completely, but truthfully. Still, there were shadows. Her son often walked at night, barefoot and silent to the orchard, his breath visible in the moonlight. Once, she followed him from a distance and found him kneeling by the rowan again, his lips moving in prayer or apology. She did not disturb him. She returned to the house and added another log to the fire. Some wounds, she knew, had to breathe in order to heal. In time, he began to laugh again. Not often, not freely, but sometimes at Tom's mischief or a story Eleanor told of his childhood. And one morning, as they harvested apples together, he lifted a bushel with both hands and said, "We should take some to the chapel, for the widows." It was the first time he had spoken of giving, of participating. Eleanor turned toward him, her hands sticky with fruit, and nodded. They like that. She did not ask him to stay, not in words, but he did. Not because he owed it to her, but because something in him had begun to root again. There was a chair by the fire that became his, a mug in the cupboard no one else touched, a coat hung by the door that no longer moved. She began to call him by the name she used when he was little. Not the full name of the grave, but the one she whispered during fevered nights, the one she sang over his cradle when the world still felt safe. And he, when he answered, did so with a softness that hadn't been in his voice for years. The truth of what had passed between them could never be explained to anyone outside those walls. Not in letters, not in stories. It lived in the quiet exchanges, in the way he took to fixing the door latch that had squeaked since Tom first arrived, in the way she laid out his old scarf when the wind picked up. It lived in the look they shared when the candle was lit each night, not as a beacon now, but as a blessing, a testament. He had been lost. She had buried him, but he had returned, not as a ghost, not as a boy, but as a man rebuilt by ruin. And she had met him not as the mother who once wept by a sealed grave, but as the woman who had learned to live beside sorrow and keep the hearth burning. In that meeting, something sacred had been given back. Not what could have been, but what remained. And what remained was enough. The morning of their walk to the grave broke clear and still. The sky above the hills brushed with faint strokes of lavender and gold. The orchard wrapped in a hush that felt almost sacred. It was not planned. No words had marked the decision. Yet something in the way her son had stood at the threshold that day, staring out at the long rows of bare-limbed apple trees, had told Eleanor that the time had come. There had been no urgency in his stance, no sign of dread, only a quiet resolve. Like a man who had rehearsed this moment in silence for far too long and finally accepted he could not postpone it further. She met his gaze briefly as he turned toward her, and without question, she rose from her chair, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped outside to join him. Tom, sensing that something intimate was unfolding, remained behind, his eyes following him from the window, but his presence gently withdrawn, like a shadow leaving the room to give the light space to expand. The earth beneath their feet was still soft from the previous night's rain, each step sinking slightly into the ground, the mud clinging to the edges of their boots. The path to the graveyard curved gently through the orchard, then across a field speckled with early crocuses, small purple petals opening toward the new sun. The air smelled of moss and thawing bark, of soil loosening its grip on winter. Birds called softly from hedgerows, tentative and spaced, as if aware that they were not simply accompanying a walk, but bearing witness to something heavier. Neither Eleanor nor her son spoke. They moved side by side, not touching, but close enough that their shadows crossed as the sun rose behind them. The old church came into view first, its stone walls worn soft by time, ivy lacing itself up toward the bell tower in threads of dark green. Beyond it lay the graveyard, quiet and unchanged, the grass trimmed low, the markers aged and leaning in their long rows. She led him without faltering to the plot beneath the rowan tree, whose branches had begun to bud again with the promise of spring. The wood of the grave marker had grayed, softened by rain and wind, the carved name faint but still legible. It was the name he had carried into war, the name the village had mourned, the name Eleanor had whispered over bread dough and beside fires, over candlelight and aching silence, across the space of 7 bitter years. And now he stood in front of it, breathing heavily, his hands clenched at his sides. He stared for a long time. The morning light cut to the rowan leaves and landed in scattered gold at his feet, catching the edges of his cloak, the fine scar that ran along his cheekbone, the shadow beneath his jaw. Eleanor said nothing. She waited, her hands clasped lightly at her waist, her eyes steady. She had already done her grieving. She had buried not just a son but a version of herself, the woman who had known him as a boy and dreamed of his future. What remained between them now was not loss, but truth, and the courage to lay that truth down, piece by painful piece. At last, he reached out and touched the wood, his fingers running along the grooves where her blade had carved the letters. He sank to his knees slowly, the movement deliberate, as though his body had prepared itself for this descent. The silence around them thickened. Even the wind seemed to pause. "I tried to write," he said at last, his voice hoarse and low. not speaking to her, but to the soil, to the place that had held his name longer than he had. But I didn't know what to say. Every word I thought it sounded like a betrayal. Eleanor stepped forward then, not to interrupt but to anchor, and sat beside him on the earth. She rested her hand on the ground where the roots of the rowan reached beneath them, and for a moment, they stayed like that, mother and son, kneeling not just before a grave but before a reckoning. "I kept it here," she said quietly, her eyes on the marker. "The grief, the not knowing. I let it root inside this ground so I could live above it. I needed to put your name somewhere it wouldn't keep breaking me." He nodded, still looking down, and his fingers dug lightly into the damp earth. "I didn't think I deserved a return. I thought you'd hate me. For the silence. For letting you mourn." "I did mourn," she answered. "But I never hated you. I hated the war. I hated the men who said your body wasn't worth bringing home. I hated the way the world went on without asking if I could bear it. But never you." He turned his head toward her then, slowly, his face streaked with quiet tears. "I wanted to come back sooner, but I was afraid that if I saw you, I'd break, that I'd see what I'd done to you, that I wouldn't know how to live with the cost." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "You didn't do this to me. The world did. Grief did. War did. But you just survived. And I am not sorry you did." For a long while, there was only the sound of the wind returning, soft through the leaves, and the distant rustle of a bird taking flight. The grave lay between them, but no longer as a barrier. It had become something else now. A threshold they had both crossed, a space that once held the shape of loss, but now held something gentler, more forgiving. Her son reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small cloth bundle. He unwrapped it carefully, and inside was a worn ribbon, blue, sun-faded, frayed at the edge. "I kept this," he murmured. "You tied it around my wrist the day I left. Said it was for luck. I thought it lost all meaning, but I couldn't let it go." She looked at it and remembered how she had wrapped it around his wrist as he stood at the gate, hands shaking, a boy on the edge of becoming a man. She reached out and touched it now, her fingers brushing the silk like she was brushing time itself. "May I?" she asked. He nodded. With slow, deliberate care, she rose to her knees and tied the ribbon around a wooden marker, nodding it once, then again. The breeze caught it, and it fluttered faintly, like a whisper given form. "There," she said. "Let it belong here now." Not as grief, but as remembrance. They stood together after that, looking down at the grave one final time. There would be no need to return often, not because it held no meaning, but because they had carried its weight with them for so long, and now it no longer needed to be carried alone. As they turned to leave, her son reached for her hand, and this time he held it not as a question, but as a promise. The walk back was quieter, but lighter. The air felt clearer. The sun had risen fully now, warming their backs, and the orchard trees swayed gently in greeting as they passed. When they reached the edge of the garden, Tom stood waiting near the gate, his hands dusty from weeding, his eyes wide with something between relief and reverence. Her son gave a small nod toward the boy, a silent thanks. Eleanor reached out and touched Tom's shoulder, grounding all three of them in the present moment. That night, they sat at the table together for supper, and for the first time in years, the chairs felt full. The candle burned steadily between them, the food warm, the silences between their words no longer heavy with loss, but spacious enough to let the light in. Her son spoke more freely now, recounting a story from his time in the hills after the war, and Eleanor laughed. Not the brittle laugh of someone remembering what joy used to feel like, but the genuine kind, the kind that rose from a place newly opened. Later, when the stars emerged, she stood at the door of the cottage and looked out into the dark. The rowan tree was just a shape in the distance, its ribbon now invisible in the night. But she knew it was there. She knew it fluttered with memory, with mourning, with mercy. She knew it bore witness. And in the silence that followed, with the warmth of her son sleeping once again under her roof, with the boy she'd grown to love breathing softly in the loft above, with the hearth no longer burning only for the dead, Eleanor whispered a thank you, not to God, not to fate, but to the sheer, impossible miracle of return. It was not the return she had once prayed for. It was slower, stranger, but it was real, and in its quiet truth, She found not only peace, but a beginning. The word spread gradually, like morning fog unfurling to the low fields, curling beneath doors and around chimneys, weaving itself into the rhythm of village conversation without ceremony or spectacle. It began with the butcher's wife, who claimed she saw him, Eleanor's dead son, walking the path toward the churchyard with mud on his boots and the solemn tilt of someone who had buried something too deep to speak of. The baker confirmed it the following day, nodding slowly as he kneaded dough, recalling how the man had stopped outside his shop, eyes tracing the cobble street like a map drawn from old memory. By the end of the week, everyone knew, though few spoke of it directly. They said only that Eleanor's candle had finally done its work, that something had followed the flame home. Yet even in their knowing, the village remained gentle. No one came pounding on her door demanding answers. No one pressed her for story. Not even those who had whispered for years that perhaps the army had made a mistake. They let her have this homecoming in quiet, letting the pieces reassemble without their gaze bearing down upon it. Instead, they arrived in the way villagers always had, in small gestures carried by hand and heart. The seamstress left a fresh length of linen on Eleanor's doorstep, its edges hemmed in careful, even stitches. The cooper sent a cask of cider, aged 5 years and sealed with wax. And the widow crane brought flowers from her own garden, zinnias and foxglove, their stems bundled in twine, the petals already curling from heat, as if to say, I too have waited for something that never came. Eleanor received these offerings with quiet gratitude, not surprised by their presence, but humbled by their gentleness. She placed the linen beside the loom, the cider in the cool cellar, and the flowers in the old pitcher by the window, where sunlight turned them golden in the late afternoon hours. Her home, which for years had borne the stillness of the grave, now pulsed with a different kind of silence, one shaped not by absence but by repair. Her son moved through it with the careful tread of a man unsure of the strength of the floor beneath his feet. He had returned, yes, but the language of home was still unfamiliar on his tongue. He worked in the garden beside Tom, chopped wood, fetched water, mended the latch on the henhouse door, and in these motions, something tentative began to form, a rhythm of reentry, not rushed, not forced, but tested in small acts of usefulness. There were moments, though, when the rhythm faltered. Eleanor would catch him standing too still in the orchard, his hand resting on a branch, as if waiting for the tree to speak. At night, she sometimes heard him stirring before the dawn, pacing softly in the kitchen, his breath uneven, as if sleep had fled from some unseen shadow. But he never asked for comfort, and she did not offer in words. Instead, she left a cup of tea at his place in the morning, always hot, always sweetened just slightly, and he drank it without fail. It became their covenant, this cup, this silence, this shared space that asked nothing and gave everything. Tom, for his part, adjusted with the resilience only children possess. He did not ask questions, nor did he cling. Instead, he watched and listened, sensing that something sacred was unfolding and that to intrude too soon would be to fracture it. He followed the man, his half-hero, half-stranger, through the garden rows, mimicking the way he tilled soil, asked shy questions about pruning or planting, and slowly earned a kind of mentorship that blooms not from declarations, but from proximity. One evening, Eleanor found him seated beside the barn, carving small birds from spare wood, their voices low and easy, their laughter quiet but real. She turned away before they saw her, blinking hard, not from sadness, but from the unbearable beauty of what could still be salvaged. As the season deepened, so too did their togetherness. They shared meals now, not just plates of food, but the long quiet that comes after, the breaking of bread followed by the reweaving of bonds. Her son spoke more easily in those hours, telling stories not of the war but the in-between years, the paths he had taken, the places where his name had fallen from his mouth like a stone too heavy to carry. He spoke of small mercies, a woman who shared soup during a storm, a boy who gave him directions without asking for coin, a dog that followed him for days until he crossed a river and could no longer hear it bark. These were not stories of heroism, but of endurance. Eleanor listened with the attention of someone gathering heirlooms, placing each sentence in the cupboard of her heart, as if it might be needed for the long winters still ahead. One morning, she woke to the sound of the loom, not her own hands, but his The creak of the frame, the rhythmic clatter of the shuttle, tentative but true. She rose slowly, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and stood in the doorway watching him. He had chosen a pale blue thread, something she would not have expected, and was weaving with the halting certainty of a man remembering a song he once knew. When he noticed her presence, he did not stop. He only glanced up, his eyes steady, and said, "I watched you for years. I never forgot the sound of this room." She said nothing, only crossed the space between them and placed her hand on his shoulder. That morning, they wove together. The silence between them was filled not with what they had lost, but with what they were beginning to build. Later that week, they cleared the grave together. It had grown over some, the grasses curling thick around the stone, the ribbon faded and barely visible. He knelt again, as he had done weeks before, but this time there was no tremble in his hand. Eleanor brought a trowel, and the two of them worked side by side, uprooting weeds, pressing new bulbs into the soil, placing fresh stones along the edge. When they finished, she placed her palm on the earth and said only, "You were never here, but I kept you company." He pressed his own hand beside hers and whispered, "I was always trying to return." They left in silence, their hands dusted with dirt, their hearts wrapped in something neither could name. The village took longer to let the knowledge settle. There were those who avoided him still, unsure what to make a man who had returned from the dead. But there were also those who opened their doors without hesitation. The carpenter asked for his help fitting new beams. The midwife sent herbs for Eleanor and asked if he might visit the widow Gray, whose son had not come home. Bit by bit, the thread of community was retied, not in great gestures, but in the ordinary work of days. Mending fences, hauling grain, lifting children onto wagons. He became a part of the village again, not as a miracle, but as a man with a past and a presence, and in that ordinariness, there was a kind of grace. The rowan tree outside the cottage had grown taller that year, its leaves thick and full, the red berries just beginning to form. Birds nested in its branches now, and Eleanor often sat beneath in the evenings, her knitting in her lap, the candle in the window burning steadily as it had for so many years. But it no longer felt like a beacon for the lost. It felt instead like a hearthfire, something steady, something returned to. Her son would sometimes join her, and Tom too, the three of them sitting in that ring of light, bound not by blood alone, but by the long, slow work of forgiveness. She knew the world would not stay still. That grief would return in new shapes. That time would take what it always does. But for now, there was peace in their small domain, a peace earned not through miracle, but through the labor of love carried out in silence and in soil, in thread and wood, in breaths shared beneath a tree that had once stood guard over a grave and now watched over the living. And in that peace, Eleanor found what she had never dared hope for, a life not untouched by sorrow, but touched also by the kind of belonging that grows quietly, fiercely, in the places where we choose to remain. 7 years after morning, when Eleanor first heard the knock that unstitched her past from her present and allowed her grief to breathe again in human form, the rowan tree behind her cottage stood tall, its bark thickened and its branches wide, sheltering a small plot beneath it where the false grave still remained. The wooden marker, worn smooth by weather and time, had not been replaced with stone, nor had it been removed. Instead, she and her son had tended it quietly over the seasons, not as a monument to death, but as a vessel that once carried the shape of their loss. Around its base, thyme and lavender now grew thick, spilling into the path, their scent rising in the warmth of each late afternoon, mingling with the smoke of the hearth and the sound of chickens scratching through the grass. Life had not returned in a single moment. It had crept in through seasons and small offerings. Each gesture, each conversation, each silence shared between them like a new page in a story they hadn't known they were still writing. Her son, no longer a man moving to the world as if it might disappear beneath him, had built a workshop beside the barn. Its beams had come from a neighboring farm that had collapsed in a storm, carried piece by piece across the field, and refitted with patience and skill. Inside, he shaped with the way he had once shaped silence, with reverence. There were toys carved for Tom, new shutters for the chapel, a cradle for the midwife's niece, spoons and bowls for neighbors who still struggled to replace what the war had taken. Eleanor often stood at the threshold of that space, her apron dusted with flour or lint from a loom, her hand resting lightly on the frame of the open door as she watched him work. She never spoke when he carved, and he never needed her to. There was understanding in their nearness, a shared agreement that the years behind them had been full enough with what could not be undone. Tom had grown tall, his shoulders broadening with the certainty of belonging, though not of her blood. Eleanor had folded him into the house with the same tenderness she had once reserved for her son. He called her Ma now, not out of obligation, but because the word had grown true in his mouth over time. He had learned to read and to mend his own clothes, to plant and harvest, to split logs and recite poems, and listen well before speaking. Her son treated the boy like a younger brother, though in truth the boy had never needed a sibling. What he had needed was home, and he had found it. Eleanor saw, in the way the two of them moved through the garden or passed tools in silence, a reflection of something longed for but never named. Continuity, inheritance, the passing of gentleness between hands that had known the opposite. One morning, in early autumn, Eleanor awoke before the rest of the house, the way she always had, though her bones now warned her cold before she even stepped out of bed. The window held the first suggestion of frost, thin and webbed along the corners of the glass like silver thread. She lit the fire in the stove and wrapped a shawl over her shoulders, moving slowly through the kitchen as the kettle began to warm and the scent of dried rosemary from the rafters stirred in the draft. Outside, mist rose in soft curls in the grass, and a quiet hush lay over the orchard. When the tea was ready, she carried it to the porch and sat on the old bench beneath the eaves, watching as the first bird calls punctured the silence. These mornings were her own, sacred not because they were solitary, but because they allowed her to remember without interruption. She thought, as she often did, of years when the porch had been a place of waiting, the candle lit in the window beside her heart's unanswered questions. Now, the same candle sat unlit, not because it was no longer needed, but because the one she waited for had returned. Its wick remained, ready if ever again it must glow. But for now, the light lived elsewhere, in footsteps inside the house, in laughter shared over meals, in the gentle patience of time finally allowed to pass. Later that day, they gathered in the garden to prune back the summer's last growth. The tomatoes had long since been picked, the beans dried and hung, and the apple trees had given their final fruit. Together, the three of them worked side by side, her son on the ladder reaching for high branches, Tom gathering the trimmings into bundles, Eleanor tying the stems with twine as she knelt beneath the tree. The rhythm of the task soothed them, and though they did not speak much, their movements were harmonious, woven together by familiarity. When the sun reached its height and the air warmed, they paused to eat bread, cheese, apples, and warm cider poured from a flask. They sat on blankets in the grass, and Eleanor listened to them talk about building a new coop before winter, about the chapel's leaky roof, about a book Tom had found in the market with pages missing but stories intact. Her heart held them there, not as a memory, but as a living thing. She looked at them, her son, returned but remade, and the boy who had once arrived with mud on his boots and hunger in his eyes, and felt the kind of fullness that does not announce itself with joy, but settles in the bones like warmth after long cold. In the weeks that followed, they began preparing for the Festival of Light, as they did each year now, stringing dried orange peels and clove-studded apples across the beams, gathering pine boughs and candles to be placed along the village path. This time, her son offered to carve the figures for the table, a shepherd, a mother, a lamb with a crooked leg. And when he set them to the window, Eleanor found herself reaching out to straighten them, then stopping, realizing they were already placed with care. The festival came and went, bringing with it music and mulled wine, the flicker of lanterns, the sound of children's boots crunching frost. Neighbors gathered outside the cottage, as they always did now, not to marvel at the story of return, but simply to be near what the house had become, a place of kindness, of shared sorrow, of quiet celebration. Eleanor stood among them with her hands wrapped around a mug, her eyes catching the dance of light across Tom's eager face and the calm in her son's smile. There were no speeches, no toasts, just laughter and flame, just presence. When the snow came, it blanketed the land in silence, drawing the horizon inward and making the world feel small enough to hold. The cottage grew softer in those weeks, The fire lit early and kept long, the windows fogged with warmth. They read aloud at night now, each taking turns, even her son, who stumbled still over some words but never hesitated to try. Eleanor spent her evenings knitting near the hearth, her feet wrapped in blankets Tom had folded, the air thick with the scent of stew and pine. It was a slow life, but it was full, and in its fullness, she found herself changed, not reborn, not made new but tempered, like metal shaped and cooled, carrying the memory of flame. As the year drew to its close, she stood once more at the base of the rowan tree. It was dusk, the sky streaked with violet and copper, and the wind low but steady. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a single match. She lit the candle that sat beneath the tree, not because she needed to guide anyone home, but as a gesture, a marking of time, a prayer of gratitude for all that had arrived. Her son stood beside her, one hand resting gently on her back, and Tom stood on her other side, his small hand slipping into hers. They said nothing, but together, the three of them watched the flame flicker, watched the light catch against the snow, watched the sky deepen above them, and in that moment, Eleanor understood what it meant to endure. Not to forget, not to stop mourning, but to build something beautiful within the ruins. The candle burned until the stars came out, steady and brave in the cold air. Then, as the wind began to rise, they turned and walked back toward the cottage. Behind them, the light remained, a quiet testament, a story not of miracles, but of staying, of returning, of choosing, again and again, to remain soft in a world that could so easily turn you hard. And when the door closed behind them, and the warmth wrapped around their shoulders like the hush of prayer, Eleanor knew the story was not over. It was simply home now, and that, at last, was enough.